Hello, Curran here. This video is about selecting a year on a line chart. See that black line there? It shows around where 2018 is. That's right now. So this could be used to answer the question, where is right now on that line chart? But furthermore, if I move the mouse, see, I can use the mouse to select the year, and that really transforms this line chart into essentially an input interface to select a year, and then you could use that selected year to, for example, filter the data that's shown in another visualization. So this is what we're going to make in this video. I'm going to start by forking this visualization, and I'll rename it to Selecting a Year on a Line Chart. And I think I'll get rid of this old README. I think I'll start by introducing the concept of the currently selected year. When I look at this, I wonder where is right now. So I'm going to add a vertical line for 2018. So that's our goal here, is to add a vertical line, and that will be positioned based on the currently selected year. So over in index.js, I think what I'll do is introduce a new variable called selected year. And I'll set that to 2018 for now. And then we can take that selected year and render a vertical line on our line chart. I think I'll put that here after our line paths, because I'd like this vertical line to be on top of the existing lines. I'm just going to make a note. We're going to make use of selected year. What we want here is a single line, a vertical line. And we can use an SVG line element for that. We can say g.append line. And when we use an SVG line element, we need to set attributes for x1, y1, x2, and y2. Since we want this line to be vertical, the x1 and x2 are going to be the same value. And the y1 and y2 are going to take the line from, let's say, the top to the bottom. So let's start by defining x1. And for this, we're going to need to take our selected year and pass it through the x scale. And x2 is going to be the same thing. So I'm going to say x2 is also x scale of selected year. Now let's deal with the y's. We want to go from top to bottom, so y1 is going to be 0, and then y2 is going to be inner height. Because remember, we're on the g element, which is already transformed by the margin. I think we're not seeing anything because we need to set the stroke for this line. So I'm going to set the stroke attribute to be black. We're seeing this vertical line here, but it's not at the place where 2018 should be. I think that's because we're not parsing the selected year into a date before passing it into the x scale. So let's make a new variable called selected year date, and let's pass that in to the x scale instead. And out here, we can compute the selected year date using parse year, and we pass in selected year. Now parse year, I believe we defined over in load and process data.js. And since that's defined there, we can just export that out of this module, export const parse year, and then over in index.js, instead of importing just that one function, load and process data, we can import that as well as parse year. Now our vertical line appears at 2018, see? It's a pretty small line though. I think I'd like to make it a bit thicker. Rather than setting the stroke to be black in JavaScript, I'm going to give this line a class so that we can use CSS. I'll give it a class of selected year line with dashes there. Selected dash year dash line. And then over in our CSS, we can select on that. We can say dot selected dash year dash line, and now we can use CSS to style it. So I'll bring back the stroke of black, And I'll make it a bit thicker. I'll set the stroke dash width to be, say, 5. All right, now we've got this very visible black line that says, all right, here it is. This is where we are now. This is 2018. What I'd like to do next is make it so that when you hover over this area, the selected year changes. So as you move your cursor around, this black line should follow your cursor. For this, we can use unidirectional data flow, where we get the events, change the state, which we already have as selected year, and then re-render based on that new state. Let's start by adding an event listener for our hover interactions. The hover interaction only makes sense inside of this rectangle. So I think what I'll do is add an invisible rectangle element on top of everything to intercept these mouse events. So over in index.js, after we render everything else, I'm going to say g.append rect. I'll use the x and y defaults of 0, and then I'll set the width and height to be inner width and inner height. Now we get this black rectangle above everything, but we want this to be invisible. So I'm going to set the fill attribute to be none. But we would like this to catch the cursor events. So I'm going to set the pointer events attribute to be all. Now let's add our event listener. We can say .on mouse move. We pass a callback. Then we can just say console.log moved, just to check if it's working. If I open up the console and then I hover over that rectangle, all right, it looks like it's working. We're getting these moved events. Now we want to get the date that corresponds to the value on the x-axis that we're hovering over. And the first step of that is to get the x position of the mouse. D3 uses a strategy where it manipulates a global variable called event. That's d3.event. So we can import event from D3, then going back down. If we just say console.log event and hover, let's see what we get printed out. We get this mouse event object. It's got all these properties on it, 2 of which are x and y. And I think these are the ones that we want. So let's console.log event.x. Now if we hover, as we get closer to the edge, it should get closer to 0, but it doesn't. See, we're at the edge and it's still like 100 pixels. I think it's relative to the parent SVG. I think one of those properties gives us relative to its parent. So I'll just hover close to the edge and then take a look at which properties we get. All of these x coordinates appear to start around 100. So I dug a little bit, and it turns out you can use d3.mouse and pass in the container, and it gives you the relative x and y coordinates relative to the specified container. And it says right here, this could be a G element. So let's use d3.mouse instead of d3.event. Up at the top, I'm going to import mouse from D3. And then in our listener, we can say console.log mouse of g.node, which gives us the DOM node. Let's see if that works. All right, if we console.log mouse of g.node and we hover over the edge of our rectangle, all right, we get close to 0 for x, which is what I was looking for. So now we can use this x-coordinate to invert the scale to get the time value for the selected year. And notice how mouse returns an array of 2 elements, the first of which is x. So instead of console.logging, I'm going to say const x equals mouse of g.node at index 0. That gives us the x coordinate. Now we can use xscale.invert. That lets us pass in the x pixel coordinate, and it should return a date. So I'll make a new variable for that called hovered date. And then I'll console.log hovered date. Now, as we hover, we get dates back out. and they do appear to correspond to the correct years. To get just the year, I believe we could say get full year on the date object. Now if we hover, it just shows the year. Look at that. Now what we want to do is set the currently selected year to be this year that gets hovered on, and then implement the rest of the unidirectional data flow pattern where we render based on the updated state. But first, we need to refactor everything to use the general update pattern. And also, all this rendering is happening right in index.js. So it's ripe for refactoring into its own component. Let's say a line chart component. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new file called linechart.js. In linechart.js, we can say export const linechart equals a function that takes as input a selection and props. And in the body of this function, we can unpack the props. And I'm not sure yet what these props will be. But to figure it out, I'm going to copy all of the logic for rendering the color legend out of index.js and into linechart.js. I'm just going to grab everything except that last bit that renders the color legend and cut that out of here, and then go over to linechart.js and paste that logic right here. Now over in index.js, let's import that component. So I'll say import linechart from ./linechart, and then we can invoke this line chart in our render function. But before we do that, I'm going to refactor our render function so that we can invoke it without passing in anything. So right now it expects data as an argument, but I'm going to remove that and just say, all right, the render function doesn't expect any arguments. Instead, it relies on the state that we have locally. So I'm going to say let data, and I'm not going to define it there, but after the data loads in this callback here of .then, instead of just passing the render function, let's pass a function that takes as input, let's call it loaded data, and then in the body of this function, we can set data equal to loaded data, and then invoke our render function. All right, now data should be defined when the render function gets invoked. One problem we have already is that we're going to be appending a new group element every time the render function gets invoked. Rather than doing that, I'm going to create a new variable for our color legend group. I'll call it color legend G, and we can create that at the time we select the SVG element. So I'll say const color legend G equals svg.append G. And while we're at it, let's create another group element for the line chart. Let's call it line chart G. And line chart G is what we can use to invoke our line chart. So we can say line chart G.call, and this is how we can invoke line chart. And the second argument here can be our props. One thing I'm noticing already is that color scale is required by the color legend, but it's not defined yet. And it's going to be also required by the line chart. So I'm going to pass in color scale there. And I think color scale is currently defined in linechart.js. Here it is. So instead of defining it in there, I'm going to unpack that from our props. Color scale. And we can define that in index.js. Maybe in our render function. And I believe there's some code that sets the domain of the color scale in the line chart. Yeah, here it is. It's unfortunately all tied up with the nested data, but that's all right. We can just move this code out of this component and into index.js. So we can just put that here in our render function. This function just depends on its input, so I'm going to move that out of our render function because it kind of clutters things up. This code here depends on color value, which I believe is defined currently in linechart.js. Yeah, so instead of having that defined here, I'm going to unpack that as well from the props. Color value is now a prop. And over in index.js, I think I'll define color value out here and then pass it in as a prop to our line chart right here. At this point, I believe the color legend should render. So if I comment out this code that renders the line chart, what's happening? I think I'd like to fix whatever errors are happening here. Okay, y value is not defined. Yeah, okay, this last y value, it depends on y value being in scope, as a matter of fact. So I'm going to move that back down into our render function. And I believe y value is currently defined in linechart.js. So I'm going to take that out of here. Yeah, here it is, y value. This can become a prop as well. Y value is a prop. So over in index.js, in our render function, I'll define y value right here, and then pass y value into our line chart as a prop. All right, now the color legend is back. Great news. So that means we're pretty much done out in index.js, and the bulk of our refactoring will be inside of linechart.js. So I'm going to go ahead and uncomment that. Now we are invoking line chart, and let's continue our refactoring in here. The title, x value, axis label, circle radius, and the margin all strike me as things that should be props. So I'll add title, x value, x-axis label, circle radius, y-axis label, and margin all as props being unpacked here. And then I'll move their definitions out of this file and over into index.js. So I'll paste them here where we invoke the line chart component. And then I'll just reformat these to be correct object notation. Going back to linechart.js, the definition of inner width depends on width, and we're also going to need height. So I'm going to add width and height as props, and we need to pass those in index.js where they are available. They're extracted here from the SVG. So when we invoke the line chart, I'm going to pass in width and height right here. Moving on in linechart.js, when we compute the x-scale domain, we take the extent of the data, which is not passed in yet. So we need to unpack data as well from the props and also pass it in from index.js. So I'll pass that in right there. I think we have everything we need for the scales. Now we need to start using the general update pattern for our DOM elements. Also, instead of using SVG, which is not in scope, we should use selection here, which is passed in as the first argument to the function. Let's use the general update pattern special case for one thing for our group element. We could say selection.selectAll, and I think I'll make a class called container, and then say .data and pass in an array with a single element. So now we've got G, our update selection. And since we're going to want to append things onto this element later, I'm going to make a separate variable for gEnter. gEnter equals g.enter dot append g. And then on gEnter dot merge g, that's where we want to set the transform based on the margin. So moving down, the next DOM element we need to manage is for the y-axis. For the y-axis G, we need to use the nested version of the general update pattern. And for the y-axis label text, we're going to have to use another level of nesting. To do that, we'll need to expose y-axis G enter and y-axis G the update selection separately. Now we want to remove the domain lines on the merged enter and update selection. So now on the y-axis G enter, that's where we can append the text, give it a class of axis-label, and then we can merge it with y-axis G.select .axis-label. And all these constants that don't depend on the props can be safely set in the enter selection, and whatever depends on the props should be set in the merged enter and update selection. Alright, so that was the y-axis. Now we can give the x-axis the same treatment. We can compute x-axis G-enter by appending a group element to G-enter, giving it a class of x-axis, and then for x-axis G, we can call G.select.x-axis, and then we can take the merged enter and update selection for x-axis G, and then call the x-axis and transform it by that inner height, and then select the .domain line to remove it. Now onto the x-axis label text. On x-axis G enter, we can append the text, give it a class, and then merge it with x-axis G.select.axis label. And again, the static attributes can be set in the enter selection. Now onto our line paths. Remember, G is the update selection, so we want to call G.merge G-enter here and put our line paths on that, the merged enter and update selection for G. I'll make a new variable called line paths. This can be our data join. And then we can say line paths.enter.append path, give it a class of line-path, and here we can merge with line paths, the update selection. And I'm noticing that nested, I don't believe, is defined. But I recall we computed that outside in index.js, so I'm gonna accept that as a prop as well. And then over in index.js, we can pass in nested as a prop. And I think it's not running because we're missing a bunch of imports from D3. So I'm just going to wholesale copy all those imports over into linechart.js. And voila, we get our lines back. But we're not seeing the color legend, so I think there's something wrong with the last few lines here. I don't believe we've imported parse year, so I'm going to go back to index.js, where we are importing that, from load and process data. And then in our linechart.js, I'll import that as well, although we don't need load and process data, just parse year. So now parse year should be defined, but we don't have selected year. This should definitely be a prop. Yeah, we don't have it yet as a prop, so I'll add selected year as a prop, and we should pass that in from index.js. See, it's defined here, selected year, so when we invoke the line chart, I'll just pass it in right here, selected year. And what else is missing in line chart? Oh, I don't think anything is missing because we're getting our color legend back. So let's apply the general update pattern for our selected year line. We can call G-enter.append line, give it a class of selected year line, and then call .merge with G.select.selected year line. And this 0 is a constant, so we can put that in the enter selection. All right, now we get our selected year line back. We can give the same treatment for our title text, and also we can give the same treatment to our mouse interceptor rectangle. Now let's see if this console.log still works. Now if I hover Oh, there's something wrong. I think it's this g.node. And you know what? We can just use sort of a simpler alternative. If we don't use the fat arrow, meaning if we say this is a function using the function keyword, instead of trying to get the node from somewhere, we can just use this, which is the DOM element that the event comes from. So now if I hover, all right, it looks like it's working again. Sweet. Now we're ready to sort of close the loop. And what we want to do here, instead of console.logging this, we should invoke a callback that's passed in through the props. Let's call it setSelectedYear. So we're invoking setSelectedYear, and this is something that we can unpack from the props. So I'll unpack that here, setSelectedYear. And then over in index.js, let's define that function right here. I'll say const setSelectedYear equals a function that takes as input a year, and then what this will do is we can set selected year equal to the year that's passed in. And since we're assigning to selected year, we can no longer use const. We need to use let here. So now we have selected year and data as part of our state. And after we set the selected year, we can invoke the render function again, completing the cycle. And the last thing we need to do here is pass in set selected year as a prop to our line chart. So I'll pass it in right there. Now, the moment of truth. If I hover, all right, it's sort of where something is broken. Something is broken, but it's almost working. There's some place in here where the general update pattern is not correctly being used. So let's see if we can find the problem. It's somewhere here in linechart.js. I think it's in this section here. Can you find it? We are appending a new group element, but we're not giving it a class of container. That's the whole problem here. So after we append the group element, let's give it a class of container. Now if I hover, all right, everything seems to work correctly, and this is our end goal here. As you hover, you can select the year. Now this line chart component can be essentially used as a user input interface for selecting the year. For example, as you change the year by hovering, we could do something like make these circles, get bigger and smaller depending on the year that you're hovering over. But anyway, that's for another video. That's all for selecting a year on a line chart. Thanks for watching. Take care.